the town that never locked its doors. Blackwood was a town that believed nothing bad could ever happen there. A quiet American town with tree-lined streets, familiar faces, and a population small enough that everyone recognized everyone else. People waved at strangers. Children played outside until sunset. At night, many residents didn't even bother locking their doors. Crime was something that happened somewhere else. Until one October morning in 2008. At exactly 6:42 a.m., a local jogger named Brian Ellis was running along the old railway bridge at the edge of Blackwood. He had followed the same route for years. The bridge was abandoned, rarely used, and almost always empty. That morning, something caught his eye near the tracks. At first, Brian thought it was a pile of discarded clothing. Then he noticed the shape. A human shape. He slowed down. Then stopped completely. A woman was lying on the cold ground, motionless. Brian stood frozen for several seconds before reaching for his phone. His voice shook as he spoke to the 911 operator. Police arrived within minutes. The bridge was sealed off with yellow tape. Squad cars blocked the road. And for the first time in decades, Blackwood woke up to flashing red and blue lights. The victim was identified shortly after. Her name was Emily Carter. Emily was 29 years old, an elementary school teacher, born and raised in Blackwood. She was the kind of person people described as too kind for this world. She volunteered at the local library, helped neighbors with groceries, never missed a family birthday. Emily had no criminal record, no history of drug use, no known enemies. To the people of Blackwood, she was untouchable. That was what made her death so disturbing. At first, investigators believed it was a robbery gone wrong. It was the easiest explanation, the one that made people feel safer. But within minutes of examining the scene, that theory began to fall apart. Emily's purse was found near her body. Inside it was her wallet, ID, and cash. Nothing had been taken. There were no obvious signs of a violent struggle. No broken bones. No defensive wounds. And then a detective noticed something that immediately changed the tone of the investigation. Emily was barefoot. Her shoes were gone. It was October in Ohio. The ground near the railway bridge was cold, uneven, and covered with sharp gravel. There was no logical reason for her to be without shoes. Someone had removed them. Deliberately. That single detail would later become one of the most important clues in the entire case. By late morning, the news spread across Blackwood. Parents rushed to schools to pick up their children. Local businesses closed early. Neighbors stood outside their homes, whispering to each other. Fear moved through the town faster than facts. People locked their doors for the first time in years. Because one thing was already clear. Emily's killer wasn't some random outsider passing through. The bridge wasn't visible from the main road. It wasn't a place you stumbled upon by accident. Whoever did this knew Blackwood. That evening, police held a short press conference. They asked residents to remain calm. They said there was no immediate danger. They promised a full investigation. But behind closed doors, detectives were uneasy. Because nothing about Emily Carter's death felt random. And as officers began searching her home later that night, they discovered something that made the situation even darker. Near the back door, partially hidden in the mud, was a footprint. A single footprint. Men's size 11. And no sign of forced entry. Which meant the killer may not have broken into Emily Carter's home at all. He may have been let inside. The last night Emily was seen alive. Emily Carter's house sat on Maple Street, a quiet road lined with identical porches and neatly trimmed lawns. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, and that was exactly why investigators focused on it so closely. There were no broken windows, no damaged locks, no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. Everything was clean, too clean. Police began reconstructing Emily's final day, hour by hour, hoping to find the moment where her normal routine broke. On the morning of October 13th, Emily woke up at 6:15 a.m., just like she did every weekday. She went to work at the elementary school, taught her classes, laughed with her students, and left the building at 3:42 p.m. Several coworkers later told police that nothing seemed wrong. Emily wasn't nervous. She wasn't distracted. She was normal. After work, Emily drove straight to her sister's house across town. They had dinner together, talked about family, and watched television. Emily left around 8:30 p.m., telling her sister she had an early morning planned. At 9:17 p.m., Emily sent her last confirmed text message. It was ordinary, casual, nothing alarming. Home now. Talk tomorrow. That message would later become one of the most haunting pieces of the case. At 10:02 p.m., a neighbor reported seeing Emily's car parked in her driveway. The porch light was on. Everything looked exactly the way it always did. After that, Emily vanished. No phone calls. No messages. No social media activity. Investigators focused on the back door of the house. That's where they found the footprint. A single muddy boot print, size 11, pressed into the soft ground just outside the door. The mud suggested it had rained earlier that evening, meaning the print was fresh. Inside the house, the back door showed no damage. It hadn't been kicked in. It hadn't been pried open. It had been unlocked. That detail disturbed detectives more than anything else. Emily was careful. She locked her doors. Everyone who knew her said the same thing. So why was the back door unlocked? Police searched the house inch by inch. There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. But something felt wrong. Emily's phone was missing. So were her shoes. Investigators checked her bedroom, expecting to find signs of someone getting ready to leave in a hurry. Instead, the bed was neatly made. It looked like Emily had never gone to sleep that night, which meant she likely left the house willingly. That possibility changed everything. Detectives began asking a dangerous question. What if Emily knew her killer? What if she opened the door for him? Neighbors were interviewed one by one. One woman reported hearing a car engine around 11:30 p.m. Another mentioned a shadow moving through Emily's backyard. None of them had called police. In Blackwood, people didn't call police unless they were sure something was wrong. And that hesitation may have cost crucial time. Phone records showed Emily's phone stopped moving at 11:18 p.m. The last signal came from near the railway bridge. The same place her body was found hours later. There were no outgoing calls. No emergency dial attempts. Just silence. Investigators began to believe Emily had been taken from her home, driven to the bridge, and killed there. But the question remained. Emily had no known enemies. No dangerous relationships. No reason to meet anyone late at night. As police dug deeper, one name began appearing again and again in interviews. Daniel Moore. Emily's ex-boyfriend. They had dated for nearly 2 years before breaking up 6 months earlier. Friends described the relationship as intense. Daniel had struggled to accept the breakup. He had been seen arguing with Emily weeks before her death. When police brought Daniel in for questioning, the town felt a sense of relief. Finally, there was a suspect. But as detectives would soon discover, focusing on Daniel might have been the biggest mistake of the entire investigation. Because while everyone was watching him, someone else was quietly disappearing into the dark. Everyone suspected the wrong man. Within days of Emily Carter's disappearance, the town of Blackwood had already found someone to blame. The eyes of neighbors, friends, and colleagues turned toward Daniel Moore, Emily's ex-boyfriend. Daniel had recently lost his job at a local hardware store. He had been struggling financially. Friends described him as withdrawn, bitter, and resentful after the breakup with Emily. Their relationship had ended 6 months earlier, but those who knew them said it had ended badly. The arguments, the tension, the unresolved feelings, all painted Daniel as a potential suspect in the minds of the townspeople. From the very first day, the whispers began. Did you see Daniel yesterday? He was angry about Emily. He always hated her leaving him. By the second day, the rumors were relentless. People crossed the street to avoid him. Mothers hurried their children past his house. Store clerks refused to make eye contact. Daniel became the face of Emily Carter's murder, guilty in the eyes of Blackwood even before the police had made any determination. Detectives brought him in for questioning. The interrogation room was small and cold, with a flickering fluorescent light overhead. The walls were bare except for a single clock, which ticked loudly, echoing in the tense silence. Daniel sat across from two detectives, hands trembling, eyes red from lack of sleep. He spoke softly but with desperation. "I didn't do this," he said. "I cared about her. I loved her. I would never hurt Emily. I was at home the whole night, alone. I swear to you, I'm telling the truth." The detectives questioned him for hours. They asked him about the breakup, his recent behavior, his whereabouts that night. Daniel answered, sometimes haltingly, sometimes breaking down in tears. Eventually, they asked him to take a polygraph test. Daniel agreed without hesitation. Hours later, the results returned, no deception detected. Despite the results, the town had already passed its judgment. Daniel became the target of angry stares, whispered accusations, and assumptions that no evidence could shake. But as investigators looked more closely at the crime scene and Emily's house, inconsistencies began to appear, details that did not match Daniel Moore at all. Her shoes were missing. The back door of her house had been left unlocked. A single muddy footprint had been found outside, men's size 11. Daniel wore a size 9. He did not own boots. Suddenly, the theory that Daniel had attacked Emily began to crumble. He was a convenient suspect, someone easy for the town to point to, but the evidence didn't support his guilt. Police began reviewing the security cameras near the old railway bridge where Emily's body had been found. What they discovered, or failed to discover, was more alarming than anything they had encountered before. A crucial section of footage, covering 11:30 p.m. to 1 a.m., was missing. No explanation was offered. No report had been filed. The tapes had simply been wiped clean. Someone with access had intentionally removed the evidence. Detectives now faced an even darker possibility. The killer was not only close to the town, but had access to official resources. Someone who could manipulate evidence, someone patient and cunning. Meanwhile, the town's focus remained entirely on Daniel Moore. He became the scapegoat, the convenient villain. The fear, anger, and suspicion of the community poured onto him, while the real killer observed silently from the shadows. The killer did not panic. He was methodical. He knew Daniel would consume the attention of investigators and townspeople alike. He knew he had bought himself more time. As days passed, Daniel's life fell apart. Neighbors avoided him. His phone rang less and less. He stopped going out at night. Friends stopped visiting. Everyone assumed he was guilty, yet the evidence told a different story. The detectives had to start asking a terrifying question. What if the person responsible for Emily's death was someone no one suspected at all? Someone who could walk freely through Blackwood without raising suspicion. Someone who understood the town's routines and the police procedures. Someone who had calculated each move with precision. As the investigation continued, another fact emerged. Emily's body had been found near the railway bridge. Yet the route from her home to that location raised new questions. How did the killer know the bridge was deserted that night? How did he avoid leaving more evidence? How had he prepared for this so carefully? The more detectives uncovered, the more it became clear that Emily's killer was not only clever, but intimately familiar with the town he hunted in. While Blackwood obsessed over Daniel Moore, the real murderer had disappeared into the night. The shadow of fear that had begun with Emily's disappearance was far from over. And the investigation was only just beginning. The evidence that disappeared. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation into Emily Carter's murder seemed to stall. Daniel Moore had been cleared as a suspect, at least officially, but the town of Blackwood still whispered his name. Fear had settled into the streets, and the memory of Emily's disappearance lingered in every corner of the small town. Detectives combed through every detail of her final hours. They retraced her steps. They interviewed friends, co-workers, and neighbors. They examined her home again, meticulously, inch by inch. And then they found something unusual. A rookie detective, working late one night, decided to review security footage from cameras around the railway bridge once more. He expected nothing. He expected static, grainy images, nothing useful. Instead, he noticed a strange gap. Footage between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m. had been wiped clean. No explanation. No backup tapes. Nothing. It was as if someone had reached into the system and erased it entirely. The detective reported it immediately. Other officers were stunned. How could such a critical piece of evidence vanish without a trace? Internal logs revealed that only a select few had access to these cameras, and all of them denied any involvement. Investigators began to suspect that the killer had been watching, possibly even monitoring the police's own surveillance systems. The thought chilled them to the bone. Meanwhile, the missing footage became a symbol of frustration for the detectives. It represented the first real barrier in a case that was already dark, confusing, and disturbing. They began to question everything. Had someone inside the town helped cover up the crime? Had someone manipulated the investigation from the start? Was Emily's death just the beginning of a pattern that the town had failed to recognize? As days passed, detectives revisited the scene near Emily's house. They measured the footprints again, examined the paths to the railway bridge, and tried to piece together the timeline. Every clue led to a dead end. Every interview ended with vague recollections, half-truths, and inconsistencies. Then, a breakthrough came in the form of an anonymous tip. The caller refused to identify themselves but spoke with surprising detail. "There's a house at the edge of town," they said. "The one everyone forgets about. The one you've never checked properly. Go there." Detectives hesitated. The house had been abandoned for years. It was decrepit, boarded up, and mostly ignored by the townspeople. But they had no choice. They had to follow every lead. When the team entered the house, the smell of decay and dust filled their lungs. It was dark inside, lit only by the beams of their flashlights. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. And then they found it. A small pile of burned clothing. A pair of women's shoes, charred but still recognizable. A knife, cleaned so meticulously it gleamed in the flashlight. The detectives froze. The items were too familiar. The shoes matched the size and style Emily had worn that night. And the knife bore no fingerprints, no DNA, no signs of recent use, but it had been there. The house belonged to no one on record. Property taxes were unpaid. No one had lived there for years. It was as if the house existed only to hide something. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Who had placed these items here? Had the killer used this house as a temporary hideout? And why had no one noticed it before? As detectives left the abandoned building that night, they realized something chilling. Emily Carter's murder was no random act of violence. It had been planned, methodical, controlled, and the person responsible for it was still out there, watching, waiting, possibly closer than anyone could imagine. The missing footage, the burned items, the careful placement of evidence, all pointed to one undeniable fact. This killer was not sloppy. This killer was smart. And Blackwood, the town that never locked its doors, was now under siege by someone who understood it better than anyone else. Second death. Blackwood tried to forget. The memory of Emily Carter's murder lingered like a shadow over the small town, but life continued. Children returned to school. Neighbors went back to their routines. And the town slowly tried to convince itself that the nightmare was over. But in 2012, for years after Emily's death, the nightmare returned. It began on a cold November morning. Mark Ellison, a 34-year-old local mechanic, failed to show up for work. His coworkers called his home, but there was no answer. Neighbors reported that they hadn't seen him leave the house the night before. At 7:18 a.m., a hiker discovered a body near the old railway bridge, the same bridge where Emily had been found. Mark Ellison. The similarities were immediate. The body was positioned unnaturally. Clothing was disheveled. And once again, the shoes were missing. The police sealed the area immediately. The town was thrown into panic. Fear had returned stronger than ever. Investigators began retracing Mark's final hours. He had closed his garage shop at 7 p.m. the previous night. He had driven home alone. No calls, no meetings, no visitors. Phone records indicated his device was last active at 10:57 p.m. near the railway bridge. The same bridge where Emily's life had ended years before. Detectives examined his home. Like Emily, there were no signs of forced entry. No struggle, No theft. It was as if someone had carefully planned the murder, mirroring the first. Questions began to pile up. Was this a copycat killer? Or had the original murderer returned to finish what was started? Was there a connection between Emily and Mark that no one had noticed? The town's fear turned into obsession. Parents warned children not to play outside. Neighbors refused to speak to one another. Every shadow became a potential threat. The investigation team expanded. They pulled old files from Emily's case, comparing every detail. Footprints, missing shoes, unlocked doors, and the old railway bridge. It all pointed to a single conclusion. Emily and Mark had not been victims of random acts of violence. They had been chosen. And the killer was methodical, patient, and still free. Police began reviewing old tips and witness statements. The pattern was clear. The perpetrator was familiar with the town's routines, familiar with its streets, and familiar with how the police operated. Someone who could move silently through Blackwood. Someone who could enter homes without being noticed. Someone who could erase evidence when needed. The detectives realized they were facing a criminal who had studied them as much as the town. The bridge had become a symbol of death. The town had a murderer in its midst. But who? And why target these particular people? As investigators began digging into Mark Ellison's life, they discovered an unsettling fact. Mark had no known enemies, no dangerous habits, no involvement in conflicts. He had no connection to Emily Carter, at least on the surface. The killings were no longer random acts. They were part of a pattern. Blackwood, the town that never locked its doors, had unknowingly become the hunting ground for a meticulous predator. And with the second death, the message was clear. The nightmare was far from over. The name that was never mentioned. 4 years had passed since Emily Carter's death. Then came the murder of Mark Ellison. Blackwood was no longer just scared. The town was in panic. Every resident, from children to elderly neighbors, felt the weight of fear pressing down on them. The railway bridge, once just a forgotten stretch of old tracks, had become a place of nightmares. Detectives worked tirelessly, combing through both the Emily and Mark cases side by side. The patterns were unmistakable. Unlocked doors, missing shoes, muddy footprints, no signs of forced entry, and most haunting of all, the killer's uncanny ability to avoid leaving any trace. Every lead seemed to loop back to one conclusion. The person responsible for these murders was meticulous, patient, and intimately familiar with Blackwood. As the investigation progressed, detectives began interviewing retired officers and former town employees, hoping someone might remember something from years ago. It was then that a retired officer came forward. His hands shook as he spoke, eyes darting around the room as if the walls themselves might be listening. "There's a name you need to know," he said. "One that doesn't appear in any official files." Detectives leaned in. The name was whispered almost reverently, Thomas Hale. Thomas Hale. No one in Blackwood had ever spoken about him publicly. He was not on any current police records. He did not appear in property filings. And yet, somehow, he existed in the memories of a few who had worked in town years earlier. According to the retired officer, Thomas Hale had been a city maintenance worker. Quiet, unassuming, invisible to most of the town. He had access to restricted areas, including municipal buildings and utility sheds. He had keys that allowed him to move unnoticed, access areas off-limits to the public. And most disturbingly, he had a history that no one in town had ever investigated closely. Hale had disappeared from Blackwood 2 weeks after Emily Carter's murder. No forwarding address. No family in the area. No public record. He was gone. Detectives immediately dug into his background. School records. Employment history. Known associates. Nothing substantial. He was a ghost. But the pieces began to fit. The missing footage from the railway bridge cameras. The burned house at the edge of town. The methodical nature of the murders. Thomas Hale had the knowledge, the access, and the patience to commit both murders, and to vanish without a trace. While detectives pieced together his history, the town of Blackwood was unaware of the new revelation. Residents continued locking doors, peeking nervously over their shoulders, and avoiding the bridge at night. The fear had become a silent presence in every home. Inside the police station, the lead detectives convened. They went over every detail again and again. Emily Carter and Mark Ellison were not random victims. They had been chosen. The murders had been planned with precision. And the person responsible had already outsmarted the police once. Detectives feared the thought. If Hale returned, there might be no warning next time. They issued alerts to neighboring towns, checked travel records, and contacted other agencies. But Thomas Hale had disappeared from the system entirely. The retired officer shook his head during the briefing. "He's clever," he said. "He knows how to cover his tracks. He always has. You'll see him in the shadows, but you'll never catch him." As night fell over Blackwood, the old railway bridge lay silent once again. But beneath the calm, a presence lingered, a shadow moving unseen, watching. The town thought it had survived, but the killer had only been hiding. And the truth was undeniable. Thomas Hale was not just a suspect. He was the invisible hand behind the terror that had gripped Blackwood. The realization sent a chill through the investigators. This was no longer a simple murder case. It was a meticulous, calculated hunt. And Blackwood was still the hunting ground. The confession that was never recorded. Blackwood had been on edge for years, but nothing shook the town like the revelation of Thomas Hale. A man who had vanished after Emily Carter's murder, whose existence was barely documented, and whose presence seemed to lurk in every shadow. Detectives dug deeper into his life, hoping to find some clue, a family member, a friend, a past conflict, but Thomas Hale had been meticulous. He left no paper trail, no financial accounts, no official records connecting him to Blackwood after 2008. Then, in 2016, something unexpected happened. Thomas Hale was arrested in another state, hundreds of miles away, for an unrelated assault. It was a minor case, nothing to make national news, but the police saw it as an opportunity. Here was a man who could finally answer questions about Emily Carter and Mark Ellison. During questioning, detectives hoped for a confession. They sat in the small interrogation room, cameras rolling, ready to capture every word. And then Thomas spoke. "The bridge," he said quietly, almost casually, "wasn't supposed to take two." The room went silent. Detectives exchanged glances, hearts racing. He was referring to Emily and Mark, two victims. But when they checked the recording of the interrogation, it had failed. The video and audio files were corrupted. The confession existed only in the memory of the officers present. No written report, no official transcript. Nothing. Despite this, the detectives noted every detail from memory. Hale spoke with chilling calm, as if recounting a story rather than confessing to murder. He gave no details of the method, the plan, or the reasoning behind the killings. He offered nothing that could lead to a prosecution. And then, in a cruel twist of fate, Thomas Hale was released. A technicality in the arrest paperwork allowed him to walk free. No charges related to Blackwood. No trial. The detectives watched helplessly as he vanished once more into obscurity. Back in Blackwood, residents remained unaware of what had almost happened. They went about their lives, locking doors and whispering to neighbors, but unaware that the true murderer had spoken and had walked away untouched. The town had been blindsided by the very person who had orchestrated its terror. Investigators began connecting dots that had previously seemed unrelated. The missing footage from the railway bridge cameras. The burned house at the edge of town. The stolen and burned shoes. The meticulous planning that left no forensic evidence. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Thomas Hale had manipulated events in Blackwood with the precision of a master strategist. He had studied the town, studied the residents, studied the police. And he had executed his plan without ever being detected. Even the retired officer who first revealed his name seemed haunted by what he knew. "He's always been clever," the officer said. "He watches, waits, and disappears. You can see traces of him, but you can never touch him. He's always one step ahead." As night fell over Blackwood, the railway bridge lay silent. The wind blew through the trees. Shadows stretched across empty streets. The town believed the worst was behind them. But detectives knew better. Thomas Hale had confessed in words that were never recorded, and that confession alone was enough to send a shiver through the entire police department. Because the person responsible for terrorizing Blackwood had spoken, and yet the law had no power over him. And the town continued to sleep, oblivious to the predator that still lurked among them. The darkness had not ended. It had only deepened. What the town helped hide. By 2017, Blackwood had changed. The streets were quieter, doors were always locked, and neighbors no longer trusted one another. But behind the everyday calm, a darker truth lingered, one that no one in the town dared speak aloud. Detectives began piecing together the final layers of the Emily Carter and Mark Ellison murders. It was no longer just about missing shoes, muddy footprints, or abandoned houses. It was about who had the power to manipulate everything, and how the town itself had unknowingly aided a killer. Old records revealed a shocking connection. Thomas Hale was not just an ordinary maintenance worker. He was the brother of Blackwood's former police chief, Richard Hale. A man who had been revered, trusted, and feared in equal measure. A man whose decisions shaped the investigations, whose influence touched every corner of the department, and whose authority could bend facts, erase files, and silence witnesses. Everything started to make sense. The missing security footage from the railway bridge? Easily explained. The burned house at the edge of town? Ignored by the authorities for years. The lack of proper investigation into Emily Carter's death? A consequence of careful manipulation. Thomas Hale had not acted alone. For years, the town's institutions, intentionally or not, had helped hide him. Evidence was buried. Witnesses were dismissed. Files were altered. And in the shadows, he planned his crimes with precision. The detectives realized the horrifying scope of what had happened. Emily Carter was not just the victim of a single murderer. She had been trapped in a system that protected the predator. Mark Ellison had become the second victim not only of Thomas Hale's cruelty but of the town's silence. Neighbors who had thought themselves safe now realized that safety was an illusion. The people they trusted, the institutions that promised protection, had unknowingly shielded the killer. As investigators revisited old leads, they discovered more anomalies. A witness who had seen someone near Emily's house late at night had been told by a senior officer to mind your own business. An officer who had found suspicious items near Mark's home had his report quietly filed away. And the anonymous tip about the abandoned house had been ignored for years. The pieces formed a terrifying picture. The killer's methods were methodical, but the town's structure had made his job easier. The very trust and routines that had made Blackwood feel safe had been exploited. Thomas Hale had learned everything he needed to know about the town. Who ignored what? Who could be scared into silence? Who would turn a blind eye? He had exploited the system, the very community he lived in. And even though he had disappeared, even though he had spoken in the failed interrogation, his presence remained. In the streets, in the shadows, in every silent corner of Blackwood. Detectives were left with a chilling realization. The murders were not random acts of violence. They were carefully executed lessons in control and invisibility. The town had unknowingly become a partner in the killer's plan. And for Emily Carter and Mark Ellison, justice remained out of reach. Blackwood had survived, but it was a survival built on lies, manipulation, and fear. And the darkness that Thomas Hale had cast over the town still lingered, unseen, silent, and patient. Because some secrets are too dangerous to expose, and some killers are too clever to ever be caught. The town's final secret. Blackwood had changed forever. The fear that started with Emily Carter's death had never truly left. Even after years, even after new faces moved into town, people still whispered about the old railway bridge, still checked their locks twice, still avoided empty streets at night. But detectives had uncovered something more horrifying than anyone had imagined. Thomas Hale had not acted alone. Not directly, but the town itself had shielded him. Through retired officers, old records, and quiet whispers from those too afraid to speak, investigators discovered the chilling truth. Hale was the brother of Blackwood's former police chief, Richard Hale. The revelation reframed everything. The missing security footage. The burned house at the edge of town. The inconsistent reports. The ignored witness statements. It wasn't a coincidence. It was protection. Evidence had been hidden. Witnesses had been silenced. Files had been altered. And the real killer had walked freely while the town's own institutions unknowingly, or perhaps intentionally, covered for him. Detectives revisited every detail with this new perspective. Emily Carter had been a beloved teacher, a kind soul, a resident who trusted her neighbors. Mark Ellison had been a mechanic, quiet, unassuming, yet in the wrong place at the wrong time. Both victims had been chosen not at random, but with precision. Hale knew how the town worked. He knew the routines of officers. He knew which people would speak and which would remain silent. He knew how to erase his tracks. And the town had helped him, whether it realized it or not. The retired officer who first revealed Thomas Hale's name seemed haunted as he described it. He knew what doors people would leave unlocked. He knew who would see and who wouldn't. The town itself did half the work for him. Even today, investigators were left asking the same chilling question. How many things had been ignored simply because someone didn't want to look? How many pieces of evidence had been buried, altered, or destroyed? And how many more victims could there have been if the town had not unknowingly protected him? The detectives pieced together the timeline. Emily Carter was killed in 2008. Mark Ellison in 2012. Thomas Hale disappeared, evading the law and disappearing into the system he understood. He reappeared briefly in another state in 2016, gave a cryptic confession that was never recorded, and vanished again. Blackwood had survived, but it was a survival built on lies, omissions, and fear. The railway bridge, the burned house, the missing shoes, the unrecorded confession, all were reminders of how easily evil could hide in plain sight. For the townspeople, life went on. Children played in the streets again. Neighbors waved at strangers. But everyone locked their doors. And everyone whispered about Thomas Hale. Because the most terrifying realization of all was this. The killer was gone, but the shadow of his crimes remained. And the town itself had become a silent accomplice. Emily Carter and Mark Ellison had died. Justice had never arrived. And Blackwood had learned a lesson too late. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing in a small town is not the killer. It's the silence. How that never left. The town of Blackwood had survived years of terror, yet the darkness never fully disappeared. The murders of Emily Carter and Mark Ellison had left scars that ran deeper than anyone could see. The shadow of Thomas Hale lingered in every corner of the town, in every locked door, in every silent street. Detectives had pieced together as much as they could. They knew the truth. Thomas Hale had planned the murders with meticulous precision. He had exploited the town's routines and the police's blind spots. He had disappeared from the system multiple times, leaving almost no trace. The town itself, unknowingly or otherwise, had shielded him. Yet there was one final twist. During a review of old evidence, a young detective discovered something overlooked for years, a series of letters hidden in Emily Carter's personal journal. They were not signed, but the handwriting was familiar. The letters described a man who watched her, studied her habits, and even referenced the town's police procedures. Every detail pointed to one thing. Thomas Hale had been closer to Emily than anyone realized. The detective cross-referenced Hale's known addresses, work records, and old utility jobs. The terrifying conclusion was unavoidable. Hale had been living in Blackwood all along in plain sight, in a house nobody noticed, while the town carried on thinking it was safe. The letters also revealed something chilling. Hale had been planning future acts. He had been writing down routines, schedules, escape routes, and even potential targets. If not discovered, he could have struck again. The revelation shocked the entire police department. It was proof of not just his cunning, but his obsession. Authorities immediately re-examined abandoned properties, old houses, and utility sheds. One house, long thought empty, showed signs of recent activity. Footprints in the mud, small traces of burned paper, a faint smell of chemicals. Hale had left, but he had been there. It became clear that Emily and Mark were not isolated victims. They were the beginning. The pattern had been intentional. The town's silence, its trust, and its routines had made it possible. Blackwood had survived, but at a cost. It had learned the terrifying truth. Evil can hide in plain sight. It can wait patiently for years. It can manipulate, plan, and strike without warning. And sometimes, the most dangerous shadow is the one that never leaves. Detectives concluded the case as best they could. Thomas Hale's whereabouts remained unknown. No arrests could be made. The town had the names, the evidence, and the terrifying knowledge of what had occurred, but justice had not been served. For Emily Carter and Mark Ellison, the story ended tragically. For Blackwood, the story became a cautionary tale. And for Thomas Hale, the shadow he cast would continue, invisible, untraceable, and eternal. The railway bridge remained silent. The burned house at the edge of town stood as a reminder, and the town locked its doors every night, knowing that some shadows are never gone. The darkness had survived, and the town of Blackwood would never forget.